This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Susan Fine. Joining me for this conversation is Jan Leisher. Jan, before we get into our discussion today, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I teach 7th and 8th grade gifted learners at Bridgewater Middle School, which is in Winter Garden.
And what subjects do you teach?
I teach civics and U.S. history.
And I'm wondering, in terms of your civics knowledge, I know that they often don't teach a course in civics at the college level to prepare teachers. Have you had the opportunity for advanced training in civics?
Absolutely. I was lucky enough to be involved last year with the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship.
And in that Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, you've become one of our civics mentor teachers, and we're so happy to have you.
And I love it. Thank you.
Jan, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to talk about Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And of course, that's something that's always a fun topic because it's people arguing, in this case arguing about the merits of the newly drafted Constitution.
You know, it's interesting because when the government was first formed after the Declaration of Independence, they formed what we call the Articles of Confederation, a state-centered government. And then from there, after several years of realizing that things just weren't quite working when all the power was held in the states, and that's really what a confederation is, that there were some discussions about tweaking the Articles of Confederation. And there was a call for convention that took place in Philadelphia in 1787. And there were people there, especially James Madison, who just felt, you know something, there has to be a shared power arrangement so that there are some things that the states just can't do, such as protect the nation, that the national government would then be responsible for doing. But still in all, those people who came with the intention of just tweaking the Articles of Confederation, they were deeply fearful of giving up their rights to a national government because after all, they had lived under a national government under the unitary government of King George III, and they had an English Bill of Rights at the time, and they still felt that those rights were not protected by the national government. And so we find that even though there was a need to create improvements, that there were still some fears, and they ended up dividing themselves between what we now call the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, those who favored a federal government and those who were against the federal government. And that really did create some divisions. What kinds of thoughts do you have on that, Jan?
Well, I think kids are always interested in the personalities. So I think it's fun for them to know a little bit about who these people were who aligned themselves as either Federalists or Anti-Federalists.
Right, and that's a great point. Like, for example, some of those divisions were not only among personalities, but they were also sort of made more enhanced by geography. So, for example, we often see that we often call the founders as being Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and James Madison. Madison and Washington were from Virginia. Hamilton was from New York. And so even to sort of have that North State division, even among Federalists, that also created different kinds of debates and concerns. Now, Thomas Jefferson, who became the 3rd president of the United States, he is often classified as an anti-federalist, but we have to be careful because he wasn't there at the writing of the Constitution. He was in France he wasn't an ambassador, he was a counselor to France, but we often see that role as being one that an ambassador would have today. But still in all, he was very much a strong states' rights advocate, so even though he wasn't there in physical form, certainly his ideas were there in the summer of 1787 when there was this debate about, you know, what do we do about the fact that these states want to keep their rights and we still have a need to have a unified national government?
We hear a lot about the Federalists, but were the Anti-Federalists led by any strong personalities such as Madison or Jefferson or even Hamilton? Or were they mostly just people who shared leadership?
Well, in fact, those three had their equals in George Mason and Eldridge Gerry. Eldridge Gerry was, of course, an interesting person, and we often hear about him even in the 21st century, maybe more than George Mason, because, yes, I mean, Eldridge Gerry, he signed the Declaration of Independence. He was also a state legislator from Massachusetts. And when it came time to draw the districts, following a census, that was the same guy.
Really?
Absolutely.
Gerrymandering?
Gerrymandering.
Oh my goodness, I had
it's
no
the same
idea.
term. So even today when we talk about gerrymandering, we're talking about that strong states' rights advocate Eldridge Gerry, who, you know, shaped a district in a way to enhance his political opportunities.
Unbelievable.
And, you know, from there, many people said that that district was shaped like a salamander, so we call it a gerrymander, and that's where we get that term today. But let's talk about that another time. We need to really focus our attention on this really important topic. When we're talking about these strong personalities, it's just this idea that people were so committed to this idea about a state-centered governance structure. And interestingly enough, you know, the Hamiltons and the Washingtons and the Madisons, the Federalists really tried hard to create a federal system, while at the same time respecting the desires of those who wanted a state-centered system. And in fact, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, you will find that 6 of the 7 articles of the U.S. Constitution give rights to the states. 1 of the 7 actually takes rights away from the states. And you'd think that that would be enough, and they still want a Bill of Rights even after that.
Wow, didn't the states all have their own constitutions where they guaranteed, you know, civil liberties and rights in their own constitutions?
Absolutely, states had their own constitutions. In fact, the first state to have a constitution was the state of Connecticut. So if you're ever driving in Connecticut, what does it say on the license plate? Constitution State. Absolutely. But still in all, I mean, I just found it very interesting that there were still concerns about rights being denied and therefore needing a Bill of Rights, which came in 1791, introduced in 1789. But yet during that summer of 1787, when these debates were going on, we see all these different ways that the states' rights were guaranteed. And I'm wondering if your students might have any interest in any one in particular. Elections?
Elections, absolutely.
Yeah, there's just so many ways. I mean, it's really kind of interesting because essentially the Constitution represents that trade-off between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or at least that's what, you know, James Madison might say. Somebody like Eldridge Gerry or George Mason might say, it's not a trade-off, you're taking rights away. But what we see in Article 1, for example, is that indeed the people through the state governments gave up the right of that self-determination in many ways, but then they elect their representation to the national legislature, and that's where we see Article 1 is the U.S. Congress. The people, through their state legislatures, could decide who would elect the President of the United States. So each state is represented similarly, but not the same way as they are in Congress. So, for example, if your state in the U.S. Congress has 27 seats, for example, 25 members of the House of Representatives, 2 senators, that equates to 27 electoral college votes. And every state is treated the same way in that regard. Every state based on their representation in Congress. And then even in 1961, the Constitution was amended so that even the District of Columbia, they're given the same number of electoral votes as the smallest state, and that is the number 3. 2 senators, 1 member of the House of Representatives goes to the smallest state, such as North Dakota, and 3 then becomes the magic number for the number of electors for the District of Columbia. We see getting into Article 3, say, what do the courts have to do with states' rights? But isn't it the Senate that confirms members of the U.S. Supreme Court, and Congress creates courts? And who elects the senators? Well, in the original Constitution, it was the state legislatures, and now, since 1913, with the 17th Amendment, it has been the direct election of senators. So already, Jan, we've been talking about, you know, of 7 articles, 1, 2, and 3, we can see how the states' voices are heard in all of those.
I do. But after they actually hashed out this form of government, it wasn't a done deal.
No.
It still had to be ratified. How do the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists come into that part of the play?
You know, and it's interesting because the ratification process is also a state-centered process. There are 7 articles in the U.S. Constitution. And if we were in Las Vegas, we'd say that's a lucky number, right? And so it's an easy way to remember that there are 7. Article 7 is the ratification process, and it says that 9 of the 13 state legislatures or their conventions must ratify this Constitution for it to take effect. when we're looking at that, that was a reflection of the problems under the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, any national decision required unanimity, just like a jury. All 13 states had to agree to any national decision. Here, it was basically rounding up from what would have been 2/3. So the nearest whole number, 2/3 of 13 is 9. So the ratification process got started, and then the state of New York tried to hold it up. They were very angry. As I told you before, Alexander Hamilton was from New York, but he took the side with Washington and Madison to leave aside the decentralized system and then to utilize a federal system. So New York really felt that it hadn't been well represented at this convention in Philadelphia. And so for that reason, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and then John Jay, who would become the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, they wrote 85 essays that were published in New York City newspapers that were really meant to convince the people to put pressure on their state legislature to ratify the Constitution.
Did that work?
You know, Jan, I don't know if it worked or not. The reason why I say that is because, first of all, New York was not among the first 9 states to ratify. So there was a new government before New York voted. The first time New York voted, they voted no. The second time they voted yes, but it was like a 52-53%. So what does this tell us? Well, it's a great story. We all love a great story. We don't even know if it's been a happy ending yet, right? But what we do know is that to this day, there continue to be conflicts over whether or not a power should be held by the state governments or a power should be held by the federal governments. So we really have these really interesting kind of debates that continue today. So yes, the ratification process ended, but the debates that led into the ratification process that were reflected in those Federalist Papers, right, certainly have not ended at all. Now, the Federalist Papers, as I said, were written by 3 people, but the 2 that have been read the most are number 10 and number 51. Have you heard of those, Jan?
I have, and
Yeah.
I have a feeling that must have been Madison for them.
Yes, Madison wrote both of those. Why do you think that 10 and 51 are the most widely read and quoted?
They must define the role of government in some way.
You know, it's interesting because in Federalist number 51, Madison talks about this idea that there had to be a separation of powers and checks and balances, and that you really deal with abuse of power by not letting anyone have absolute power, right? And then in Federalist Paper number 10, Madison talks about extending the sphere, allowing more voices in the political process, including the state governments and the local governments. And when you do that, you also can mitigate any kind of abuse of power and one entity having too much power. There's a famous quote in Federalist 51. I love this quote. It says, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Okay? Now, what does that tell us? That there has to be a government, and that's really where the Federalists and Anti-Federalists really were. The one source of agreement that they had was we have to have a government. We just don't quite know what kind of government best serves the people. And what Madison was trying to do in the Federalist Papers was to say, the best kind of government is a federal government, while at the same time respecting and reflecting the will of the people and respecting that there are states here that are closer to the people, and the states that are closer to the people might have a better understanding about what the people want, and therefore there has to be a set of governments in place that are close to the people. And so we find today, for example, that this idea of separation of powers and checks and balances, it's held at the federal level, but also every state government has the same thing. So we really have so many interesting ways of looking at that ratification process and the Constitution and the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in terms of sort of not only a great story, but also how they help us understand politics today. Jan, I wish that we were not out of time, but unfortunately we are. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been my pleasure. I love talking about these guys.
And I love how they really help us better understand contemporary politics today. Today we've been talking about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and how their conflict led to what we now know to be the U.S. Constitution. We also learned about how the Federalists and Anti-Federalists debate led to the Bill of Rights. This has been Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Susan Fine.